Hi everyone, thanks for watching. I'm Faye and I'm a software engineer at Woodside based in Perth, Western Australia. Today I'm going to share with you how I utilise AWS in my day-to-day life. Yes, I use it extensively in my job, as do many other large enterprises. But it's not just for the big players. The platform is also geared towards the everyday developer, giving you the ability to develop and deploy a mobile or web application at speed and ease. So here's a snapshot of what the next 20 minutes will look like. I'll begin with a brief introduction of myself and my journey to the software engineering world, how I use AWS outside of my job as an everyday developer, and the example I'll show you today is how I built an application that helped assist me when studying for my AWS certification using the AWS Amplify service. Then a brief overview of what AWS Amplify is, followed by a demonstration. I'll create a new React application, use AWS Amplify to create my backend infrastructure, and this will include Amazon Cognito for authentication, AWS AppSync, GraphQL API, and Amazon DynamoDB for data storage. And then we'll go ahead and deploy the application to AWS. So without further ado, let's kick off. Let me give you a bit of background about myself. Again, I'm Faye, a software engineer at Woodside. Now, my journey to the software engineering world hasn't been the most conventional. I started my career on Chevron's Gorgon project, which is the construction of an LNG plant on a remote island at the top of Western Australia. And it was here I wrote my first line of code. I was initially hired as an admin and was entering data all day long. So inspired by true laziness, I began automating my tasks. I got more and more practice at it, and this eventually over time turned into my full-time role, creating technological solutions for departments across site. By the time my employer transferred me to Darwin LNG, I was totally obsessed with my newfound skill. But coding in ASP.NET and just HTML, CSS, the applications didn't look very appealing. The functionality was there, but usability and aesthetics were definitely not. So being a self-taught programmer, I was really yearning for some kind of formal education in this space. I never studied computer science or software engineering at university, so I was completely green to the industry. Once the construction phase was over in Darwin, I hopped on a plane and spent 4 months in Utah at a coding bootcamp called Dev Mountain. And it was here I got the opportunity to learn the latest technologies. The same technologies that were also used by Netflix, Instagram, LinkedIn. So that for me was really exciting, to be edging closer to that standard of software development. By the end of the 4 months, I graduated and I could build cloud-native applications that I never thought I'd get the opportunity to build. My time at Dev Mountain set me on the course I'm on today, a software engineer at Woodside. Outside of Woodside, I'm also one of 3 founders for a meetup called Female Coders Collective. FC2 was created to provide a safe environment for female developers actively working in the industry to come together and share knowledge, code, and ideas. When we think of AWS, we automatically associate the service with what they're known for, big enterprise cloud computing. But AWS is perfectly geared to support not only the big players like BMW, Netflix, and Slack, but also the everyday developer. Let's go back to May 2020. When I was preparing for my AWS Developer Associate exam. Now my chosen method of study is by flashcards. I love them. I like to write down questions about topics that I want to deeply understand and answer them without hesitation. So I'd carry around this wad of paper everywhere with me. It'd be in my backpack so I could study on public transport on the way to work, on my lunch break, and sprawled all over the dining table. Not to mention, it's just a waste of paper. So I thought it'd be better to have these flashcards with me all the time, but not squashed in my backpack, rather in the cloud. I was able to do this quickly using AWS Amplify. AWS has made this service so simple to use that you can have an application hosted in minutes. The backend infrastructure that was required for my application was created with just one command through the command line interface, and setting up authentication, which can typically take days, is done in minutes. If I was doing this 10 years ago, I wouldn't go to the trouble of creating an application for something like this. The juice just isn't worth the squeeze. Back then, software development really was something you'd only see in large organisations. And that's the beauty of AWS. It's not just for large companies that have money and resources. Anyone, the everyday developer, can create infrastructure in the cloud with ease. Now, what is AWS Amplify exactly? AWS Amplify is a set of tools and services that enables mobile and front-end web developers to build secure, scalable, full-stack applications powered by AWS. On the AWS Amplify website, there are 3 main benefits. Firstly, it allows you to configure AWS backends fast. Eliminate ClickOps. And by ClickOps, I mean clicking through the various menu options to configure resources in AWS. This approach is slow, repetitive, and error-prone. Amplify eliminates ClickOps completely. The user enters a default command and it does the grunt work on your behalf. You don't even need to open the console. Second benefit, easily connect to your app. You can use Amplify libraries to connect new or existing cloud backends to your mobile and web application. These open source client libraries are supported from multiple frameworks, including React, React Native, Angular, Vue, and Ionic. This includes a load of libraries, but the main ones we'll touch on today are authentication, data storage, and serverless APIs. The third benefit mentioned is the ability to deploy web apps in 3 steps. Deployment has never been easier. There's no need to create a pipeline from scratch. The Amplify console is super intuitive, and once you hook up your repository, the deployment process is no more than 10 minutes. You can go make a cup of tea, and by the time you're back, your app is hosted on AWS. So stick with me for the rest of this presentation for the more technical part, as I walk you through how you can also use this service to quickly host an application, just like I did for my flashcard app. Today, we will create a simple web application. We have a React app set up with Amplify. For authentication, we'll create an Amazon Cognito user pool and use Amplify's UI components for the sign-in page. For data storage, we're going to have a DynamoDB NoSQL database and use AWS AppSync to manipulate the data using the GraphQL API through defined queries and mutations. Now, when I first started using Amplify, I used the Getting Started guides on the AWS website, and I found they were excellent, really easy to follow. So if you're just getting started out and you want to learn more, the AWS website is the best place to start. So now you know what we're building today. Let's get into the code. To get us started, I've created a basic React app using the create React command. And today, the simple web app we'll be building is a to-do list app. But before we go ahead and use the Amplify CLI, you need to do 2 things first. Install the CLI globally so we can use the Amplify commands. And secondly, configure an AWS account using the command amplify configure, which will ask you to log into the AWS console and create a role to give permissions to Amplify. We will skip these 2 steps in today's demonstration, but be mindful that they are prerequisites for initializing your project with Amplify. So let's go ahead and initialize our to-do list project by running the amplify init command. Here we're going to be asked a series of questions about our app, beginning with the name. So I'll keep the default Amplify app. The name of the environment will be dev. My default editor is Visual Studio Code. Type of app I'm building is JavaScript, and the framework is React. I'll keep the source directory path and the distribution. Build command and the start command will be the default. And next it's going to ask me if I want to use an AWS profile. In this case, I'll select yes. And I have 2 profiles set up, and I have an Amplify specific one which I'd like to use. And so what's happening now is Amplify is using CloudFormation to provision resources to get us started. We'll create a project in Amplify console, and we'll also get an Amplify folder structure in the project's root directory with the initial project configuration. And so this process will take around 30 seconds to a minute. Now that our project has been initialized and our app is in the Amplify console, we can go ahead and create our backend resources. If you remember back to our architecture diagram, we were using a GraphQL API. So let's go ahead and create that API Using Amplify, add API. And we'll be asked a series of questions, beginning with the type of API. So select GraphQL. I'll keep the default API name, and the default authorization as per our architecture diagram was Cognito user pool, and we'll keep the default config on that. And how do we want users to be signing in? I'll select username, and do I want to configure advanced settings for this? I'll say no, I'm done. And do you want to configure advanced settings for the GraphQL API? I'll also select no, done. If you have an annotated GraphQL schema, let's select no in this instance. And the schema template will be a single object with fields. Do I want to edit the schema now? I'll select no. So essentially with this one command, we have our Cognito user pool, DynamoDB, GraphQL API and AppSync all ready to go. Now nothing is created in AWS yet until we enter the command amplify push. So let's go ahead and do that. Now that that's finished provisioning, let's see what's changed in the front end. So under the source folder, we have a folder for GraphQL. And within that, we have a file for mutations, queries, and subscriptions. So mutations are for manipulating the data. And by default, Amplify will give you a create mutation, update, and a delete. Now queries are for fetching data. We have two by default. One for listing all of our to-dos, which will give us every item from Dynamo. And we have a get to-do, so if we pass in an ID as a parameter, we'll receive just one item back from Dynamo. And finally, subscriptions. Subscriptions are webhooks between your client and the server. Basically, when your data changes, your front end changes immediately without the need for polling. So as you can see, a bit has changed on the front end. So let's log into the console and confirm that our resources have also been created. So let's begin with AppSync and make sure our API exists. There we'll go to AppSync service, and there we can see we have an Amplify app-dev. And we have our schema, and under data sources we can see that a DynamoDB table has been created. So if we log into DynamoDB next, we should see that table exist. If we click tables, and there you have it, at the very bottom we have our to-do list table. And lastly, let's log into Cognito and make sure our user pool exists. And there it is, Amplify app user pool. Awesome, so it looks like we're ready to go. We've confirmed our backend infrastructure exists. Now let's work on connecting our React app to our resources. I've gone ahead and set up the implementation for fetching and posting data to DynamoDB. So let's log in and have a look. As you can see, we're greeted with the out-of-the-box Cognito sign-in page. Now, I've already signed up for the application, but you have the option to also create an account here. So if you go ahead and complete the form, you'll receive a verification code via email, and once verified, you'll be signed into the application. But since I've already done this step, let me go ahead and sign in. And on render, the application fetches all of the existing items from our DynamoDB table. And I also have the ability to add to the table. So let's add shopping to the list. And there you have it. I've posted a new item to our Dynamo table, which is immediately visible because of our subscriptions. So there was no need to fetch the data again. So how is all of this working? Firstly, let's look at the configuration. The initial configuration involves installing two packages. If we open the package.json, you'll see on line 6, we have an AWS Amplify UI React package, and on line 14, an AWS Amplify package. Once both of these packages have been installed, you need to configure Amplify in your app.tsx file. So as you can see on line 10, all that Amplify configure is doing is setting the AWS resources we want to interact with, and it uses the config data in the AWS exports file to do this. So if we go ahead and open that up, you'll see within this file is all of our configuration data for our resources. You can see the GraphQL API endpoint, the user pool ID. So essentially, everything in this file is what's required for our React app to interact with AWS. So how did I set up the out-of-the-box sign-in page add a new item, and fetch items from DynamoDB. I'll go through all three implementations, but first let's begin with authentication. It's super simple. There's no need for making your own component, as Amplify has already done it for us. So in app.tsx, you'll see here on line 5 that I've imported Amplify Authenticator. So when a user's logged in, our to-do list will be returned. Otherwise, the sign-in page is returned, which is controlled by this ternary statement on line 23. You'll also notice in the useEffect hook, we have an onAuth UI state changes function. This function will fire whenever the state of the authentication UI component changes, and it ensures when a user is not logged in that they'll be redirected to the sign-in page. So how are we adding an item to our to-do list then? Let's open the add.tsx file. So you can see we import create to-do from our Mutations file and API and GraphQL operation from AWS Amplify. Then under our save function, you'll see we pass in 2 arguments into the GraphQL operation, our mutation and our variable. And in this case, our variable is the item that we want to add to our to-do list. And retrieving the data is just as simple. Let's open the list component and take a look. So again, we import our list to-dos from queries, and on top of that, we import again API and GraphQL operation from AWS Amplify. Now, as I want to fetch this data on render, you'll see that it's called under the useEffect hook. So in this instance, we only pass in our query, as I only want to return the entire list. So now the fun part. Let's deploy our application to AWS. For the final part of the demonstration, I'll deploy our Amplify app to AWS. To do this, I've logged into the Amplify console and selected my Amplify app. Before we continue, make sure you've set up a repository in your chosen repository hosting service. In this instance, I'll be using GitHub, so the first thing we need to do is hook up that repository and choose a corresponding branch to build and deploy. The next part of the deployment process is to confirm our build settings. I'll need to select my backend environment, which in this case is dev. And in order to deploy backend functionality during the build and deploy phase, we need to create a role to grant Amplify permission to interact with resources in our account. Now, as I already have a role set up, I'll go ahead and select that one. If you haven't got a role, just click Create New Role and Amplify will handle this for you. Next, let's verify that the build commands and build output directory is accurate. If you'd like to modify it using the built-in YAML editor, you can go ahead and make changes by clicking on this Edit button. You can also save your build settings on AWS servers, or you can download the YAML and add it to the root of your repository. And finally, we review our settings. We need to make sure that everything's been set up correctly, which all of this looks good to me. So let's go ahead and save and deploy. Now this will take a few minutes based on the size of your application. And deployment is now complete. As you can see, each phase has a green tick against it. And if you click on any of the 4 phases, you'll be able to view the build logs. You can also see the build duration. In this instance, it took 9 minutes and 43 seconds. And also our domain. So this is the URL that AWS Amplify has given our application, which you can also create a custom domain for. So let's check out our app. Good to see our authentication's working. So let's go ahead and log in. And we can see our to-do list items have successfully fetched. Now let's add an item to our list to make sure that that's working. And there you have it. We can fetch data from Dynamo and post data successfully. Our hosted to-do list app is interacting with our AWS backend resources. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you learned something new today, and you can see how easy it is to use AWS Amplify if you'd like to create an application that is secure, scalable, and fast. I've uploaded the code from today to my GitHub account, so feel free to follow the link in the QR code. I've also added a link to the Female Coders Collective meetup page if you'd like to be part of this amazing group. If you have any questions about today's presentation, stick around for Q&A.